Good evening, my dreaming souls. Tonight, we travel back to the blazing heart of the ancient world, the mighty city of Babylon. A place of wonders, yes. Hanging gardens, golden temples, and towering ziggurats that kiss the sky. But don't get too romantic. You wouldn't last a day here. The sun alone could break you. The laws? Written in stone, yes, but also written against you. And the temples? They never closed. Not for sleep, not for silence. Every moment in Babylon was ruled by ritual, heat, and eyes that never looked away. So before you cool down for the night, take a second to like this video, subscribe for more lost history, and let us know. Where are you listening from? Now, dim your lights. Let the past breathe. And ask yourself, could you survive a single day in the city that never rested? Let's just say it plainly. You would not last a day in ancient Babylon, not a full one. Maybe you would survive the morning if you stayed in the shade and kept your mouth shut. But by the time the sun hit its highest point, you would be dizzy, dehydrated, and probably yelling at a priest without realizing it. Which, for the record, would be a very fast way to get fined, beaten, or sacrificed, depending on the mood of the gods that day. Babylon was brilliant, beautiful, and absolutely exhausting. Let's start with the weather, because it hits you first. Babylon was hot. Not summer in the suburbs hot, not beach day hot. This was dust in your teeth, melt your eyebrows, dry breeze like an oven door hot. The kind of heat that wrapped around your neck like a wet scarf and stayed there smiling. Shade was a luxury. Water had to be drawn or carried. And if you thought you could just slip into a fountain to cool off, forget it. That water was sacred, watched over by temple staff who would chase you off with sticks, or worse, report you to the scribes who loved nothing more than writing down who broke which rule and when. And the rules. Oh, the rules. Babylon ran on laws the way a beehive runs on buzzing. If you breathed, there was probably a rule about how you should do it. They were not small laws either. We are talking about hundreds of stone-carved regulations, laid out in full by kings like Hammurabi, whose famous code covered everything from theft to divorce to exactly how deep your irrigation trench could be. And if you broke a law, the consequences were, let's call them memorable. Steal a goat? That could cost you a hand. Accuse someone falsely? You might get tossed in the river to see if the gods thought you were lying. Spoiler, the gods were not known for their generosity. Get on the wrong side of a temple official, or trade with the wrong weight of silver, or speak badly of someone above your station, and suddenly you found yourself kneeling in front of a judge wearing more makeup than mercy. The city itself did not help. Babylon was enormous. For its time, it was the definition of a metropolis, a sprawling grid of sun-baked streets, canals, ziggurats, and noise. Imagine stepping into the middle of it and immediately being pulled in 6 directions at once. The streets were crowded with merchants barking out prices, animals clopping over bricks, children running underfoot, and officials with scrolls trying to enforce laws written in wedge-shaped cuneiform that looked like someone had dropped a toothpick collection into wet clay. You would get lost, for starters. Babylon was full of winding alleys and narrow corridors, some designed that way to confuse invaders, others just the result of thousands of years of building on top of itself. Signs? None that you could read. Most people were illiterate, and even those who could read needed to learn a script that required hundreds of symbols, each pressed into clay with a stylus. You could not just ask for directions either. The locals spoke Akkadian, a language that would sound nothing like anything you have ever heard. Even if you learned a few phrases, good luck understanding the fast-talking, slang-slinging market crowd. And then there were the temples. You might think, great, a temple, somewhere peaceful, somewhere to sit, cool off, and think about life. Think again. Babylonian temples were loud, busy, sacred engines of bureaucracy and ritual. They never closed, ever. 24 hours a day, priests, priestesses, singers, scribes, guards, cooks, and caretakers moved like clockwork, offering sacrifices, recording omens, burning incense, and feeding the gods. Not symbolically either. The gods had physical statues housed in inner sanctums, and those statues were dressed, bathed, and fed like royalty. Miss a ritual, skip a step, or offer the wrong kind of fish? That was a serious offense. And if you accidentally stepped into a temple zone without the right ritual cleansing, you might have cursed the whole neighborhood. People would not just stare, they would scream. Someone might tackle you. Someone else would run to fetch the priest. You might be fined, shaved bald, or forced to stand in the sun holding a dead chicken as penance. Babylon was not forgiving. Babylon was watching. But for all its rules and heat and confusion, the city pulsed with life. It smelled like spices and livestock, like fresh bread and hot stone. Music played on lutes and drums. Dancers moved through the streets during festivals, covered in gold and paint. Trade came from every direction: ivory from Africa, tin from Anatolia, cedar from Lebanon. Babylon was the beating heart of a world that stretched far beyond its walls. That also meant people came from everywhere: traders, envoys, warriors, slaves, scholars. You would hear dozens of languages, see people in robes, tunics, armor, and jewelry you could not name. You would taste food that left your mouth burning and your eyes watering. You would be dazzled by the hanging gardens, if they existed, or at least by the grand palaces and high walls carved with images of lions, bulls, and kings towering above the people below. But again, you would not last. You would not know which god to greet before drinking water from the well. You would not know which street was reserved for nobles, or which gate led to the ziggurat, and which one to the prison. You would not understand that some slaves had more power than free men, or that calling someone by the wrong title might get you flogged. You would be too hot, too confused, too foreign. By mid-afternoon, your skin would be red, your throat dry, your brain spinning from the smoke of offerings and the shouted warnings of angry vendors who thought you were stealing just because you stared too long at a pomegranate. You might try to run, but to where? Every alley looked like the last. Every doorway led to more shouting. And yet, for the Babylonians, this was life. This was order. This was greatness. In the next part, we will slow down and look at the people who actually lived there. Not the kings and scribes, but the everyday citizens, the potters, bakers, soldiers, slaves, and shepherds who built this city one mud brick at a time. Because once the shock wears off, Babylon is not just a maze of heat and rules. It is a home, just not yours, not yet. By now, you have made it to noon in ancient Babylon. Barely. Your throat is dry, your feet ache, and your head spins from the sound of languages you do not understand and rules you keep accidentally breaking. But before you completely collapse, let's slow things down. Let's walk through the lives of the people who actually belong to this city. Because despite all the confusion, Babylon was built by people just trying to make it through the day just like you. Let's start with the potter. He's not a priest, not a merchant, not a soldier, just a man with dust on his elbows and clay under his fingernails. His shop is tucked behind a busy street where smoke from his kiln mixes with the scent of roasted onions and goat stew. He wakes before sunrise, eats a piece of flatbread, then kneads clay with practiced hands. His wife helps, shaping little bowls and lamps. His children stack dried bricks under a canvas shade. They do not complain. They know that each cup sold is a few extra barley cakes for dinner. His customers vary. Some are farmers needing sturdy storage jars. Others are temple workers looking for incense burners or offering bowls. Occasionally, a scribe will order a finely decorated item for a high official. But no matter the buyer, every transaction is watched closely. Prices are strict. Silver must be weighed properly. If a pot cracks too soon or the glaze flakes off, there might be a complaint. Too many complaints, and a visit from a temple clerk might follow. Then there's the scribe. While the potter's hands are coated in clay, the scribe's are stained with ink. He sits behind a low desk, surrounded by tablets of baked and drying clay. His stylus, carved from reed, taps out symbols in rows so precise they look like tiny city streets. He records transactions, writes letters, copies laws, and calculates tax reports for the temple granaries. His work is dry, repetitive, and unrelenting. But he is literate, and in Babylon, that means power. Only a tiny fraction of the population could read and write. Scribes were trained from childhood in tablet houses, drilled day after day in cuneiform until their fingers cramped and their backs ached. They were expected to memorize long passages, translate between languages, and calculate everything from the weight of barley to the number of sheep owed in tribute. They were the glue of Babylonian bureaucracy, invisible, but essential. Next, the merchant. He's a man of smells and sounds. His stall is packed with fabrics from the west, spices from the south, maybe even lapis lazuli from lands far beyond the horizon. He has the voice of a priest and the patience of a fisherman. He calls to customers with practiced charm, haggles with sharp smiles, and watches your hands more than your face. Theft is common, and so are false weights. Every deal is a dance. Every coin counted twice. Merchants are respected, but not entirely trusted. Some grow rich, others disappear overnight. They trade in goods, but also in gossip. They know which priests are building new altars, which officials are short on funds, and which nobles are planning to marry off a daughter. In Babylon, information can be worth more than silver. Then there's the woman behind the oven. She rises before dawn and grinds barley with a stone roller while the city is still asleep. Her arms are strong from years of kneading dough. Her back curves from carrying baskets. She bakes flatbread on a clay dome, flipping them quickly, stacking them for sale by sunrise. Her house is small, shared with cousins and in-laws. Privacy does not exist, neither does rest. She cooks, cleans, collects water, mends clothing, cares for children, and sometimes sings songs from her girlhood when no one else is listening. She is not nameless, but her name would not appear in most records unless she was caught in a legal dispute or listed in a marriage contract. She knows the laws, but not all the words. She speaks in gestures, glances, and long silences. She knows who to avoid on the street which guards to smile at, and which corners are never safe after dark. And we cannot forget the slave. Babylon had many. Some were born into it, others captured in war. A few sold themselves to pay off debts. Their lives were hard, but not all the same. A house slave might serve drinks and sweep floors. A temple slave might clean altars or tend sacred animals. A field slave would work from sunrise to darkness, covered in dust and silent sweat. Some slaves could earn money, some could buy their freedom, but many did not. Their fates depended on the mood of their masters, the stroke of a pen, or a change in the law. They ate last. They slept in corners. They lived quietly and often died unnoticed. All of these people, the potter, the scribe, the merchant, the woman at the oven, the slave in the field, they were the breath of the city. Their routines, stacked together like bricks, built Babylon day by day. They did not wear golden robes. They did not pass laws or build temples. But without them, the ziggurats would crumble, the markets would empty, and the gods would go hungry. To survive in Babylon, you had to understand your place. You had to watch, listen, and obey. You had to move with the rhythm of the city, even when it hurt, because there was no room for hesitation. Not in a place where the sun burned high, the rules ran deep, and every mistake had a price. In the next part, we will step inside the temples of Babylon, not as guests, but as workers. We will explore the rituals, the hierarchy, the sacred spaces, and the strange and powerful jobs that came with serving the gods of the ancient world. Because in Babylon the gods did not sit quietly in the sky. They had mouths to feed, clothes to wear, and calendars that never allowed a day off. You might think stepping into a temple in ancient Babylon would be a break from the chaos of the city. Cool walls, quiet prayers, a little shade from the blazing sun. But if that's what you were hoping for, you've badly misjudged the situation. Babylon's temples were not sanctuaries. They were institutions massive, demanding, and humming with activity every hour of every day. Enter one as a visitor, and you might get confused. Enter one as a worker, and you would be begging to go back to the dusty streets before your first shift ended. Let's start with the gods themselves. In Babylon, the gods were not abstract beings floating above the clouds. They were household names with personalities, moods, and very real to-do lists. Each god had a physical image, a statue carved from wood, gold, or stone that was not just decorative. It was treated like a living being. It had to be dressed, fed, entertained, and cleaned. Think of it like having a royal guest who never left and had very specific tastes. Temples were built like palaces, with wide courtyards, inner sanctums, kitchens, workshops, storage rooms, and offices. Each one belonged to a specific god or goddess. Marduk was the headliner, the chief deity of Babylon, but dozens of others filled the city, each with their own staff and responsibilities. Entering the main temple of Marduk was like stepping into the headquarters of a powerful corporation mixed with a royal court and a theater company, all wrapped in layers of incense smoke. Your role might depend on your class, your family, or your training. If you were born into the priesthood, congratulations, your days would be filled with ritual recitation and a long list of actions you had to get exactly right or risk cosmic offense. If you were not from a priestly line but worked in the temple, you might be a cook, a cleaner, a singer, a doorkeeper, a butcher, or a brewer. Temples had their own economies. They owned land, collected tithes, and employed large teams of people to keep the divine machine running. Let's say you were assigned to the kitchens. You rose before dawn. Not a soft dawn, either a dusty, dry Babylonian morning where the air already felt thick and your feet hit the stone floor before your eyes were open. You washed quickly, always with the right words and gestures, because cleanliness wasn't just about hygiene, it was about ritual purity. You walked through silent courtyards to reach the kitchen where fires were already burning, bread was baking, stews were simmering, and the food wasn't for you, it was for the god. The meals were prepared with ceremony. Measurements had to be exact. The animals had to be spotless, selected days in advance, often raised specifically for sacrifice. When ready, the food was carried to the god's chamber, placed before the statue, and left for a time while prayers were chanted. No one actually believed the god chewed and swallowed, but it was said the divine presence consumed the essence of the food. Afterward, the offerings were removed, and if you were lucky, you might be allowed to eat the leftovers. Yes, divine leftovers, not glamorous, but better than going hungry. If you worked in the laundry team, your job was to care for the god's clothes. Fine linen, gold-threaded garments, jewelry, headdresses, all stored in temple wardrobes and swapped out regularly. Each dressing was a ceremony. You didn't just throw a robe over the statue. You sang, you bowed, you moved with precision. Every thread had symbolic meaning. Every color had weight. A wrinkle or stain might be seen as an insult. One wrong move and someone might be reassigned to sweeping out ash pits for the next 5 years. Then there were the temple singers and musicians. Every ceremony had music. Songs for sunrise, chants for purification, melodies to accompany sacrifices. These performers were highly trained, sometimes starting as children, learning hundreds of lines of hymns in Sumerian and Akkadian. The rhythms were complex, the pronunciation strict. You could not improvise. The gods, after all, had been listening to the same songs for centuries. They expected you to get the notes right. And in the middle of it all were the priests. They walked like they owned the ground beneath their sandals, because in many ways they did. High-ranking priests were not only religious leaders, but powerful political figures. They negotiated land deals, advised kings, and controlled temple wealth. Their robes were spotless. Their speech was polished. They moved through the temple like stage actors, every gesture choreographed, every word meaningful. But even they were bound by rules. The gods were demanding employers. What would happen if something went wrong? Let's say the oil burned too quickly during a ritual, or an animal offered at the altar turned its head the wrong way, or the barley bread cracked instead of staying whole. These were seen as signs, omens, warnings from the divine. The ritual had to be redone, prayers extended. Sometimes diviners were called in to interpret the error. In worst cases, a scapegoat might be chosen, a substitute animal, or even a person who would be symbolically punished to reset the balance. Working in the temple wasn't just physically exhausting, it was mentally draining. The pressure to get everything right every time was constant. There were no breaks, no holidays. Even festivals, though joyful for the public, meant more work for temple staff, more sacrifices, more processions, more preparation. The gods did not sleep, so neither did their servants. And don't think you could fake it. Babylonians believed the gods could see everything, and so could the priests. Gossip was thick in temple halls. A missed prayer, a smudged line in a tablet, a late arrival, it would be noticed. Punishments could include fines, demotion, or being transferred to more humiliating duties, like emptying chamber pots or cleaning altars after animal sacrifices, scraping blood and ash until your fingers blistered. In short, if you walked into a Babylonian temple hoping for peace, you'd find pressure instead. Ritual, routine, and responsibility hung heavier than the heat outside. And while the gods may have accepted your service, they demanded your full attention always. In the next part, we'll walk deeper into the city's legal heart, the courtrooms, contracts, punishments, and how ancient Babylon kept order with a system that could be both impressively advanced and painfully unforgiving. Because if you thought the temple rules were strict, just wait until the judges get involved. Let's imagine for a moment that you've made it through your first day in ancient Babylon without fainting from the heat or offending a high priest. You might even be feeling a little confident. But confidence can be dangerous here, especially if you trip over the tangled web that was Babylonian law. And trust this, there was a law for everything. Babylon was one of the first civilizations to attempt a truly codified legal system. Long before modern courtrooms, legal textbooks, and televised trials, Babylon had stone stelas, public judges, witnesses with long memories, and a strict, sometimes terrifying idea of justice. The most famous of these legal codes came from King Hammurabi, who ruled around 1700 years before the birth of Christ. He wasn't the first to write laws, but he was one of the first to carve them in stone and put them where everyone could see. The stele that bears his name is almost as tall as a man and contains nearly 300 laws etched in tight cuneiform script. These laws were not tucked away in some archive. They were displayed publicly. Not because Hammurabi wanted to show off his kindness, but because if you broke a rule, ignorance wasn't going to save you. Picture this. You're standing in the middle of a crowded street, and someone accuses you of shortchanging them in a deal. You swear you didn't, but they're yelling loud enough to attract attention. A scribe hears the commotion and notifies a court official. Before you can explain, you're dragged into a small building packed with people, scrolls, and arguments. That's court in Babylon. Fast, crowded, and confusing. There's no lawyer. No one is assigned to explain what's going on. You're expected to know your rights, your obligations, the details of your case, and the legal customs. Most people didn't. Trials were based on testimony, witnesses, and written contracts assuming you had one. If you didn't, things could get very unpleasant very quickly. Let's talk about those contracts. Everything in Babylon came with a contract. Marriages, loans, sales, employment, adoption. Even buying a goat required the right documentation. These were pressed into clay tablets, signed with seals, and stored in archives or private homes. If you lost your copy, too bad. If the other person had a copy and you didn't, they usually won. The scribes who wrote these contracts were crucial. Their wording could shape the outcome of a dispute. That's why everyone wanted a good scribe, one who wouldn't accidentally leave out a clause or scribble a name wrong, because a misspelled name wasn't just embarrassing. It could change everything in a legal case. Let's say you rented a donkey from a neighbor and it fell into a canal. Whose fault was it? The law had rules for that. If the canal was open and you weren't warned, the owner of the land paid. If the canal was marked and you ignored it, you paid. If the donkey slipped during normal travel, there might be shared blame. All of this depended on the exact wording of your agreement if you had one. Otherwise, the judge would decide based on testimony, divine signs, or, in some cases, ordeals. Yes, ordeals. You heard that right. If evidence was unclear and witnesses disagreed, some cases were settled by trial through ordeal. One common method was river judgment. The accused would be thrown into the Euphrates. If they floated or swam to safety, the gods had spared them. Innocent. If they drowned, well, then they probably weren't innocent. Justice by way of river current. It sounds absurd, but it made a kind of sense in a world where the divine was baked into every part of daily life. The gods saw everything. The gods had the final say. If you were innocent, they'd save you. If you weren't, they'd let you sink. Of course, this system heavily favored people who could swim or bribe someone to tug on a hidden rope. But that's Babylon for you, fairness, with a wink. And then there were the punishments. Babylonian justice was not subtle. If you stole something, your hand might be cut off. If you lied in court, you could lose your tongue or be branded. If you killed someone's ox through negligence, you might have to pay with your own livestock or your own freedom. But not all punishments were physical. Some were economic. Fines, land seizures, forced labor. Your class played a huge role too. A noble and a commoner breaking the same law might face very different consequences. So might a man versus a woman. This was not a society where justice was blind. It had eyes, and it noticed your clothes, your accent, your seal, and who your friends were. That's not to say the system was completely broken. In fact, for its time, Babylonian law was remarkably advanced. It protected orphans, punished false accusations, and established rights for women in marriage and inheritance. But the key word here is for its time. You would struggle to navigate it. You wouldn't know the signs. You wouldn't understand the gestures. You'd be lost in the jargon, unable to read the script or summon witnesses. You might speak up when you should stay silent, or worse, stay silent when you should speak. And if you thought explaining that you were just visiting from a few thousand years in the future might help your case, let's just say you'd probably end up being examined by a priest for demonic possession. Babylon kept order through a complex, layered, and deeply rooted legal system. It was a city built on structure. The scribes kept the records. The courts enforced the codes. And the people, for the most part, followed the rules because the cost of breaking them was just too high. In the next part, we'll walk into the bustling markets of Babylon, where trade ruled, currency clinked, and haggling was an art form. But beware. If you thought the courtroom was stressful, wait until you try to buy a simple piece of cloth without accidentally insulting 3 generations of a merchant's family. It might seem simple enough. You're hot, tired, and desperately in need of something to drink. You wander into the market, thinking you can just hand over some silver, grab a jug of beer, maybe a fresh piece of flatbread, and go about your dusty Babylonian day. But the moment you step into the heart of the market, you realize this place is a beast. The market in Babylon was not a casual stop. It was a swirling, sweating, shouting ecosystem of trade and tension. Narrow lanes crammed with people. Stalls overflowing with grain, onions, fish, wool, fruit, and pots of honey. Merchants lined the edges like wolves in linen robes, calling out to customers, sizing up travelers, watching everything. You could not walk 5 steps without being hit with smells, bumped by elbows, or pulled into a conversation you didn't want to have. There were no shopping carts, no labels, no fixed prices. Every purchase involved a small performance. You asked how much. The seller raised an eyebrow and gave a number that was always too high. You pretended to be shocked. You offered something insultingly low. He scoffed. You narrowed your eyes. He lowered his voice. You glanced at the next stall. He swore his figs were fresher. You sighed. He dropped the price. You agreed. You handed over silver carefully weighed on a balance scale, and both of you pretended you had won. Except you didn't win. Not really. That merchant had been playing this game since before you knew how to pronounce barley. He read you the second you stepped into his lane, saw your clothes, your hesitation, your unfamiliarity with the rhythm of the market. You were a mark, a walking wallet with sandals. He sold you the bruised figs and made you feel like you had gotten a deal. And good luck with the money, by the way. Babylon didn't have paper bills or crisp coinage with presidents on them. Instead, most trade was handled with silver measured by weight. That meant everyone had to carry small scales and know the value of shekels and minas. Too much silver, and you overpaid. Too little, and the seller would shout loud enough to draw the attention of a nearby scribe who might fine you for fraud. Even honest mistakes could turn into arguments, and arguments in the market could attract guards. Guards did not like being called in over plums. Let's say you got through that ordeal and you want to buy something larger, maybe a goat or a few clay jugs. You are now moving into contract territory. Many market transactions were written down, even for livestock and bulk grain. The scribe's stall stood near the edge of the marketplace, shaded by a cloth canopy and surrounded by trays of fresh clay tablets drying in the sun. You would sit with the seller, explain the deal, and the scribe would tap out the agreement in cuneiform with his stylus. You signed with your seal, pressed into the clay like a fingerprint. The tablet was then baked and stored or taken home. Lose the tablet, and you might lose the goat. Or worse, be accused of theft if someone else claimed they had bought it first. This happened more often than you'd think. Babylonian merchants were sharp. Contracts were their shields, and anyone without one was vulnerable. You never just bought something, you joined an economy of evidence. The goods themselves were another challenge. Grain had to be clean, dry, and free from bugs. Figs and dates had to be soft but not overripe. Oil was often cut with cheaper fats. Beer could be watery or bitter. Pottery could be thin or cracked. Wool could be poorly spun. Every item had its tricks, and every merchant had ways to hide them. You needed eyes trained by years of trade to know the difference. If you were cheated, there was little hope of a refund. No receipts, no complaints department, just your word against theirs, and theirs came with a cousin in the temple and a friend in the scribe circle. You also had to be careful about what you asked for. Certain goods were temple property grain harvested from temple land, or oil pressed for offerings. Accidentally buying something sacred could get you fined or worse. Some items required priestly permission to handle or sell. You didn't want to accidentally purchase meat that had been partially dedicated to a god and take it home for dinner. That could earn you a bad omen, or a very stern visit from someone wearing a gold headdress and carrying a scroll of curses. Then there were the festivals. During major religious celebrations, the market swelled with pilgrims, merchants, dancers, and pickpockets. Temporary stalls popped up, offering charms, statues, rare fruits, or animals for sacrifice. The energy was intense. Music blared from flutes and drums. Fires burned. Foreign traders shouted in languages you didn't recognize. Everyone was louder. prices higher, tempers shorter. A festival market was thrilling and dangerous. One wrong turn and you were lost in a crowd. One loose pouch and your silver vanished. One joke about a god and you found yourself being chased by an angry priest holding a roasted fish. You had to know how to move. Experienced shoppers wore simple clothes, kept their silver tucked inside their robes, and walked with purpose. They knew who to trust, which stalls to avoid, and how to get out of a deal gracefully. You, on the other hand, probably smiled too much, asked too many questions, and hesitated at all the wrong moments. And that's before we even get to the matter of language. The market spoke a dozen dialects: Akkadian, Sumerian, Amorite, even bits of Elamite and Hittite, depending on the traders. Everyone knew enough to argue over prices, but if you said the wrong word, you might end up ordering goat dung instead of goat cheese. Not ideal. Especially if the merchant was too polite to correct you until after the sale was made. Still, the market had its charm. Children darted between stalls. Dogs sniffed around for scraps. A woman played a harp while her daughter sang. A man sold painted beads strung on copper wire. A boy walked past balancing a basket of warm bread on his head, and over it all, the smell of cinnamon, cumin, and river mud. The market was where Babylon breathed. It was where farmers met scribes, where nobles brushed shoulders with travelers, where business, gossip, and sacred ritual all blurred into one ongoing performance of trade and trust. In the next part, we will walk through the homes of Babylon from grand townhouses to one-room mud-brick dwellings and look at how people lived when they finally escaped the heat, the noise, and the endless rules of the city. But make no mistake, even at home, the gods still watched, the laws still applied, and privacy was a luxury few could afford. At last, you think, a place to rest. You've spent the day navigating rules, avoiding priests, haggling in a noisy market, and trying not to insult any divine statues. Now all you want is a quiet, private place to cool off and catch your breath. But in Babylon, home was not necessarily a retreat. It was just another layer of structure, ritual, and noise, with slightly more shade. The first thing that would surprise you is what Babylonian houses were made of. Stone was rare. Wood was precious. Most homes were built from mud-brick slabs of sun-dried earth mixed with straw. Strong enough to last through the seasons, but soft enough to crumble if not maintained. That meant walls had to be repaired often, roofs recoated with clay, and floors swept constantly. If the rainy season came early, or the walls were left untended, your quiet home might slowly melt back into the street. Now imagine living in that house with a dozen other people. A typical Babylonian household wasn't just a nuclear family. You'd often find 3 generations under one roof: grandparents, parents, children, sometimes cousins, aunts, uncles, and maybe a few servants or slaves if the family had the means. That meant the house was rarely, if ever, quiet. Children played, elders told stories, women cooked, men sharpened tools or worked accounts. Someone was always doing something, and that someone was always in your way. Rooms were arranged around a central courtyard, the heart of the house. It was open to the sky and often the only source of natural light. That courtyard might contain a small shrine, a cooking area, or a drying rack for laundry and herbs. In wealthier homes, it had benches, painted pottery, or even a small fountain. In poorer homes, it was just a dusty square where chickens clucked and water jars sat in the shade. You did not have your own room. The idea of personal space, of closing a door and being alone, did not exist for most people. You shared your sleeping space, your meals, and your daily routines. Beds were made from mats or wooden frames covered in woven cloth, sometimes placed on raised platforms to stay above the dust. Privacy came not from doors, but from looking the other way and pretending you didn't hear your uncle snoring. Bathrooms were simple: a clay pot for waste, emptied regularly, a water jar for rinsing. No plumbing, no soap, no long showers. Cleanliness was measured more in ritual terms than in modern ones. Before entering a temple or performing certain tasks, you washed not always to remove dirt, but to symbolically prepare yourself for sacred contact. That said, people still bathed regularly, usually in basins filled with water drawn from wells or canals. Scented oils and ash were used for scrubbing. They did their best. But in the heat of Babylon, you probably still smelled like sweat by lunchtime. Meals were a family affair. Bread was the constant flat, round, made from barley or wheat. It was dipped in oil, wrapped around dates, or eaten with stew. On special days, you might have lamb or goat. Fish came from the canals, grilled or dried. Onions, garlic, lentils, and cucumbers were common. Wine and beer were served in simple clay cups. The food was flavorful, spiced when possible, and eaten with fingers or small knives. Meals were not silent. They were loud, full of conversation, interruptions, and reminders not to feed the dog your leftovers. And speaking of dogs, animals were everywhere. Goats bleated from rooftops, chickens wandered through courtyards, and cats prowled for rodents. They were not pets in the modern sense, though children might give them names. They were part of the household machinery, as necessary as the fire pit or the grain jar. Everyone had a job, even the animals. Women worked non-stop. Inside the home, they cooked, cleaned, spun wool, wove cloth, brewed beer, raised children, tended the sick, and handled the household gods. Many also worked outside as market sellers, priestesses, or midwives. Their roles were complex. A Babylonian woman could own property, sign contracts, and even sue in court. But her freedom depended on her class and family. A high-born wife might manage estates. A servant girl might never leave the kitchen. Children were everywhere. They played with clay figurines, sang songs, and copied what they saw. Boys trained early in trades, especially if their father was a craftsman. Girls learned household skills and temple rites. Education was rare. Unless you were destined to be a scribe, then you were sent to the tablet house, where you practiced cuneiform until your fingers cramped and your teacher ran out of patience. Most children were expected to contribute early. Childhood was short. Responsibility came fast. Every home had its gods. You didn't worship just at the temple. Each family kept household idols, small clay or stone figures representing gods, ancestors, or protective spirits. They were placed on shelves or altars, given offerings of incense, grain, or beer. If something went wrong in the house, illness, bad dreams, spoiled grain, the family might consult a priest or diviner. Maybe the gods were angry. Maybe a ritual had been missed. Maybe someone stepped on a sacred threshold with the wrong foot. Superstition was thick in the walls. Amulets were hung near doors. Spells were whispered at night. Pregnant women carried charms to ward off spirits. Even the placement of rooms and stairways could follow omens and astrological signs. The house was not just a building, it was a living thing, part of the world's sacred order. And when the sun set, the city did not go silent. Candles flickered, the air cooled, neighbors leaned over walls to talk, children chased fireflies, music floated from the courtyards of wealthier homes. You might hear a priest chanting, a merchant practicing his sums, or a woman humming while weaving by lamplight. The night had its rhythm slower, softer, but still full. You might think, this is the part where you lie back and finally sleep. But you'd be wrong. You forgot about the mosquitoes, about the snoring, about the sudden late-night knock at the door from a cousin with news, or a neighbor worried that the stars looked strange. Sleep came in stretches, interrupted, light. You dreamed of water, of shade, of space. But when you woke up, there was bread to bake, floors to sweep, and clay jars to refill. The home never rested. Not really. In the next part, we'll leave the homes and step into the military world, the guards at the gates, the soldiers at the borders, and the armies that protected Babylon's power. Because while the temples and markets ran the city, it was the soldiers who kept it standing. And even in peace, Babylon never truly let down its guard. By now, you've survived the temples, the markets, the laws, and the heat. You've slipped through crowded alleys, ducked under banners of incense smoke, and managed not to offend anyone wearing gold or holding a scroll. But there's one group of people you've probably tried to avoid: the men with swords. Babylon's soldiers weren't just warriors. They were law-keepers, tax enforcers, border guards, and sometimes executioners. You might see them patrolling the gates, sitting under canopies near the main roads, or standing stiff and silent outside a palace. But don't be fooled. These men weren't just there for show. Babylon took its security seriously, and life in the military? It was hot, hungry, and heavy with discipline. Let's start at the city wall. Babylon's outer walls were towering marvels, famous across the ancient world. Some claimed they were so wide that a chariot could race along the top, an exaggeration maybe, but not by much. The gates were massive, carved with lions and bulls and reinforced with bronze. These gates didn't swing open casually. They were guarded day and night by men who knew that a single mistake could bring disaster. A new recruit posted to the city wall began at the bottom. He would be assigned to watch shifts, 2 at a time, under a sun that scorched the back of his neck and armor that soaked up the heat like a clay oven. He stood with spear in hand, eyes scanning the horizon for smoke, dust, or figures on horseback that didn't belong. Inside the gates, soldiers kept the peace. They weren't chasing petty thieves; those were handled by temple guards or neighborhood elders. But riots, smugglers, suspicious travelers, that fell to the regular troops. They wore leather armor, sometimes reinforced with bronze scales. They carried curved swords, spears, and occasionally bows. Their helmets were simple but effective, built to deflect a blow and keep the sun out of their eyes. They were not glamorous. Their boots cracked. Their rations were dry. They trained with weighted weapons and marched until their feet bled. They lived in barracks, often sleeping on straw mats, with personal belongings stored in wooden boxes tucked beneath benches. Privacy? None. Comfort? Minimal. Purpose? Clear. For soldiers stationed at the city's edge, the challenges grew sharper. The Babylonian Empire stretched far across the Fertile Crescent. That meant long borders, many of them hostile. The soldiers out there weren't just waiting for trouble, they were in it. They lived in forts, small settlements built near rivers or along trade routes. There they faced desert heat by day and biting cold at night. They had to defend against raids from nomadic tribes, thieves who knew the terrain better than any map, and the constant risk of running out of food or fresh water. Patrols rode for hours, eyes sharp for ambushes. Archers trained constantly, their arms thick from pulling taut bowstrings. Slingers practiced with stones, aiming for speed and silence. When war came, and it did, Babylon could field large, disciplined armies. The king's military was organized with ranks, supplies, and battlefield strategies. Siege towers, battering rams, chariots pulled by sturdy horses. Armies carried banners into battle, painted with gods or animals meant to strike fear. They believed they had divine backing, that Marduk himself marched with them. But even with the gods on your side, war was ugly. Swords did not slice like in the movies. They broke bones. They tore flesh. Arrows didn't always kill. Sometimes they stuck, quivering in muscle, leaving men screaming on the ground. Wounds turned septic. Soldiers limped back to camp, feverish and pale, hoping the healer had enough herbs or honey to keep them alive. A soldier's greatest fear wasn't death, it was surviving just enough to suffer. Discipline was everything. Desertion was punished with death. Cowardice in battle could lead to being trampled, beaten, or tied to a post as a warning. Loyalty to your captain, to your company, to your gods, it was drilled in daily. Even off-duty, soldiers were expected to train, guard, or help with public works. You might be repairing canals, stacking bricks, or hauling stones for a new road. There was no day off, only different work. And yet, people volunteered, not always out of loyalty or patriotism, sometimes because there was no other path. The army offered food, shelter, even a small wage. For some, it was better than poverty. For others, it was the only way to rise. A soldier who proved himself could earn land, status, or a post in the palace guard. He could return home with scars and stories, maybe even gifts from the king. And the king's army needed stories. When a campaign ended, the survivors marched through Babylon's gates to the beat of drums. They were covered in dust, wrapped in flags, flanked by musicians. Crowds cheered, vendors shouted. Children ran alongside, wide-eyed. This was the part that made it into the records, the parades, the victories, the lines of defeated enemies shown bound and silent. What didn't make it into the carvings were the missing faces, the friends buried by moonlight, the nights spent digging shallow graves with chipped blades. Even in peacetime, the threat never vanished. Babylon feared rebellion, raids, and unrest. Soldiers had to be ready. They patrolled canals, escorted merchants, protected temples during festivals, and kept an eye on travelers. They were everywhere and nowhere, often unnoticed, until trouble began. You might pass them on the street and think nothing of it, until you saw one step forward with a spear and shout for silence. Could you last a day in their boots? Maybe. If you were strong, quiet, and obedient. If you could march in step, hold your tongue, follow orders, and fight when told. But the real challenge wasn't the training. It was the weight. The unrelenting pressure of being the wall between order and chaos. The heat, the loneliness, the knowledge that if you failed, Babylon fell with you. In the next part, we'll shift from steel to stars, exploring Babylon's obsession with the skies, the zodiac, and the gods' messages hidden in moonlight and shadow. Because while soldiers guarded the gates, it was the astrologers and diviners who guarded the future. And in Babylon, Every decision worth making started with a glance toward the heavens. Look up. In Babylon, the sky was never just the sky. It was a living map, a pulsing script written by the gods. Every star, every moon phase, every shadow slipping across the sun, it meant something. And if you didn't know what it meant, someone else definitely did. Because in Babylon, the real power didn't always sit on a throne. Sometimes it stood quietly on a temple roof, watching Venus blink just a little too early. The Babylonians were master skywatchers. Long before telescopes, they tracked the movement of planets with the naked eye. They watched for comets, charted eclipses, counted days between moon phases, and scribbled down everything. It wasn't for curiosity, it was for survival. The gods, they believed, sent messages through the heavens. If you knew how to read them, you might predict famine, flood, war, or peace. If you didn't, you were walking blind through the world. Now, before you imagine soft-voiced stargazers with long white beards and polite curiosity, let's be clear. These men were scientists, yes, but also servants of power. Their charts could change the course of empires. A single cloudy night might delay a coronation. A shadow on the moon might cancel a military campaign. If Mars rose red and angry, a king might change his alliances or order a sacrifice to cool the god's temper. You, of course, would not be allowed near any of this. Astrology in Babylon was sacred. It belonged to trained scribes and priests who had spent years memorizing tables, symbols, and omens. They kept their records on clay tablets, lined with tiny, precise cuneiform lists of star positions, eclipse predictions, and what each sign had meant in the past. If a solar eclipse had once preceded a rebellion, that omen stayed tied to eclipses forever. It was not just astronomy, it was history in the sky. Imagine being one of these scribes. You rise before dawn and climb to the top of a temple tower, perhaps a ziggurat, high above the city. The air is cooler here, but your legs are sore from the steps. You unwrap your scroll, set your stylus, and begin watching. The stars are familiar. You know them like friends. Each has a name, a mood, a meaning. Some rise early, others drift late. You watch their positions against the horizon and compare them to your charts. If something is off even slightly, you record it. And then you wait, because it's not just what you see, it's what you feel. A sudden wind, a bird flying the wrong way, clouds parting unexpectedly. These are signs, too. The gods don't just speak through light, they whisper through movement, rhythm, pattern. It's your job to catch the message before it disappears. Later, you'll bring your notes to a senior priest. He'll ask what you saw. You'll present the tablet. If the signs are serious, say, a planet rises reversed or a halo appears around the moon, the message goes straight to the palace. The king listens. His advisors listen. No decision is made without the stars weighing in. This is where things get risky. If your reading is wrong, if you miss an omen, misread a position, or suggest the wrong ritual, the consequences are steep. At best, you're humiliated. At worst, you're punished for misleading the king. Your mistake could be blamed for a crop failure, a plague, a failed siege. It's a heavy burden reading the future. And you're expected to carry it with confidence, even when the skies are silent. The average Babylonian couldn't read the stars, but that didn't stop them from believing in their power. People paid for personal divinations, not just from astrologers, but from other forms of ritual reading. A liver from a sacrificed animal, for example, could be studied like a map. The shape of its lobes, the texture, the color, these were signs. The gods, it was believed, left their messages in every detail of the world, if only you knew where to look. Dreams, too, carried weight. You might wake up from a restless sleep and stumble to a local temple, heart-pounding, because you dreamt of a lion in your bedroom or a river running backward. A priest would interpret your dream using a tablet of known meanings. A lion might mean strength, but in the wrong context, it could signal danger. A reversed river might mean betrayal. The solution? A small offering, maybe a recited prayer, maybe a spell written on a scrap of clay and buried near your door. Babylon's world was a world of signs. Everything was layered with meaning. A sneeze during a business deal could be a warning. A broken pot might signal a death. A black dog crossing your path was not just a dog. You didn't shrug these things off. You took them seriously. You adjusted your day, postponed your trip, or made a quick stop at the temple to seek guidance. Could you survive in this world of signs? Maybe not. You would be too literal, too modern. You would miss the hint, ignore the cloud, step on the threshold with the wrong foot. You might make a joke about Mercury in retrograde and find yourself accused of mocking Nabu, the god of wisdom and writing. Not a good move. Babylon was not interested in doubt. The gods were watching. The stars were recording. And everyone, from kings to cooks, shaped their lives around what the heavens whispered. Still, there was beauty in it. The night skies over Babylon were astonishing, wide, dark, and clean. No electric lights, no airplanes, just a vast, endless dome filled with stories. The archer, the lion, the bull, the fish. Star patterns that still shape our constellations today. The Babylonians gave them meaning, gave them power, and trusted them to guide everything from harvests to heartaches. In the next part, we will descend from the stars and step into the underworld, or at least Babylon's understanding of death, ghosts, and the afterlife. Because no matter how carefully you read the stars, no one could escape what came next. And in ancient Babylon, the dead were never entirely gone. They lingered, watched, and sometimes came calling. Babylon was a city of order. Every brick, every canal, every law carved into clay served a purpose. Life was hard, but it made sense at least most of the time. You worked, you prayed, you traded, you obeyed, and then one day you died. And what came next? Well, the Babylonians had an answer, but it wasn't comforting. There was no heaven in the clouds, no shining paradise with feasts and harps. The Babylonian afterlife was not a reward. It was a fact, cold, heavy, and unavoidable. They called it the land of no return. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a literal realm, a dark and dusty world beneath the earth where the dead lived on in a kind of shadowed existence, not tortured, not joyful, just there. Your soul, called your Itemu, didn't float upward. It went down to the underworld ruled by the goddess Ereshkigal, who had no patience for complaints. You passed through 7 gates, each one demanding you surrender something, your clothes, your name, your memories. By the time you reached the end, you were silent, pale, and stripped of everything but the faint outline of who you had once been. And that was the good outcome. If your funeral rites weren't done properly, if no one said the right prayers, gave the right offerings, or buried you with care, your soul might not rest at all. It might linger. It might wander. It might become something worse, a ghost. Ghosts in Babylon were not campfire stories. They were part of daily fear. A restless spirit could bring illness, nightmares, madness. It could ruin crops, sour beer, or steal sleep from a whole house. People carried amulets to ward them off. Priests recited rituals to banish them. Exorcists were consulted like doctors, trained in chants and charms meant to drive spirits back to their place. What caused a ghost to rise? A lot, actually. Die in battle without burial. Drown and remain lost. Be murdered and never avenged. Be cursed. Be forgotten. Even a slight mistake in the funeral process, forgetting to burn the incense, placing the body in the wrong position, could lead to a haunting. The dead needed respect. They needed food, drink, remembrance. A cup of water poured at their grave. A bit of bread left at a shrine. Without these things, they became hungry, bitter, cold. Imagine being in a Babylonian home at night. The fire is low. The walls are quiet. Then a cup falls over for no reason. A dog growls at an empty corner. Someone in the house starts murmuring in their sleep, repeating a name no one has spoken in years. You don't shrug it off. You don't say it was the wind. You light a lamp. You whisper a prayer. Maybe you go to the temple the next morning and ask for help. Because that ghost, that could be your fault. It could be your brother, your servant, your neighbor from 5 houses away. And if it's angry, it doesn't care who was to blame. Burials were serious. Most people were buried close to their homes, sometimes in courtyards or under floors. Cemeteries existed too, but being close to family mattered. The dead weren't gone. They were part of the household, and sometimes they were quite literally beneath your feet. Wealthier families could afford more elaborate tombs, stone sarcophagi, or painted coffins. They might hire a priest to chant proper send-offs or burn special incense to guide the soul. Poorer families did what they could, wrapping the body, saying the words, lighting the fire. But even the smallest gesture mattered. A neglected dead could turn on the living. And not all the underworld stories were simple. Some people believed that powerful souls could influence the world above. There were tales of dead kings appearing in dreams, of heroes returning as ghosts to offer advice. Diviners sometimes consulted the dead not directly, but through rituals meant to thin the wall between the worlds. This was dangerous. The dead were not always honest. And if you opened that door, it might not close easily. The underworld itself was described as a dusty plain where souls wandered like birds, eating clay and sipping stale water, not as punishment, but simply because that was the way of things. No fire, no glory, just an eternal grayness. Occasionally, one soul might be called back through magic, dreams, or ritual. But most remained there forever, staring upward through the earth, listening for the footsteps of those who would someday join them. To a modern person, it sounds bleak, but to a Babylonian, it was logical. Life was hard. Why should death be any easier? The goal wasn't to escape suffering. It was to live rightly, honor the gods, respect the dead, and hope your name was spoken long after you were gone, because to be forgotten, that was the worst fate of all. And so people remembered. They lit candles, they told stories, they passed down names. Every year, families held remembrance meals. Plates were set out for the deceased. toasts were made. Not in celebration, but in duty. You fed your ancestors so they would not haunt you. You honored them so they would not be lonely. It was not love as much as it was respect and fear. Could you survive a Babylonian night with all this in your mind? You would try to stay brave. You would hum to yourself. You would tell yourself that ghosts aren't real, that dreams are just dreams, that the cracked noise you heard near the back wall was nothing. But in Babylon, nothing was just nothing. Everything had a reason. And if you didn't know it, someone else did, someone with a candle, a chant, and a long memory. In the final part, we'll climb back into the sunlight and take a wide look at Babylon's legacy, what it left behind, how it echoes in our modern lives, and why, despite all its rules, dust, and discomfort, the city still captures the imagination. Because, for all its danger, Babylon was never just a place. It was a legend. And legends don't die quietly. So you made it, or at least you survived long enough to know why you probably wouldn't have lasted a full day in ancient Babylon. The heat, the rules, the food, the gods, the guards, the ghosts, every layer of life in that ancient city pulled at you, tested you, pushed you to adapt or falter. Babylon didn't make things easy. It wasn't built to comfort. It was built to endure. And endure it did. For centuries, Babylon stood as a symbol of power, wealth, and complexity. Even when the bricks began to crumble and the palaces fell into silence, the city remained in the minds of poets, priests, kings, and conquerors. You might not have lasted a day, but Babylon lasted millennia. So, what did it leave behind? Start with the laws. Hammurabi's code wasn't just a list of punishments. It was one of the earliest expressions of rule-based governance, of a world where justice was written down, where contracts could outlive kings, and where a farmer could demand fairness from a merchant using words carved in clay. Today, when you read a legal document or sign a contract, that idea of binding agreement echoes back to those dusty Babylonian tablets. Then there's the writing itself. Cuneiform, the wedge-shaped script pressed into wet clay with reed styluses, was one of humanity's first systems of writing. It started with simple symbols to track trade and taxes, but grew into myths, prayers, hymns, and mathematics. From accounting to astronomy, Babylon recorded it all. Thousands of years later, archaeologists still read those tablets, still hear the voices of merchants, scribes, kings, and cooks etched into the earth. And don't forget the stars. When you check a horoscope or glance at the night sky, thinking something in it might explain your mood, you're borrowing from a Babylonian worldview. They turned skywatching into science. They tracked Venus, mapped Jupiter, and predicted eclipses centuries in advance. They believed the heavens mattered not just for gods, but for people. Today's astrology, for all its modern flavor, rests on their shoulders. Architecture, engineering, agriculture, ritual, mathematics. Babylon touched it all. Its bricks were molded from river mud. Its walls climbed high. Its canals fed farms that kept cities alive in the middle of a desert. Its scribes could calculate land division, interest, and square roots using number systems based on 60. That's why we have 60 seconds in a minute and 60 minutes in an hour. It all loops back, quietly, to Babylon. But beyond the tangible, there's something else Babylon left behind, the weight of complexity. Babylon wasn't easy. That's been the theme of this entire journey. It was layered, ritualistic, demanding. You couldn't walk a single street without engaging with some larger structure of power, belief, or memory. You were constantly reminded of your place in the order of things. That kind of world could be exhausting, but it could also be deeply meaningful. Because Babylon didn't ask you to be aimless. It gave you purpose. Maybe not the kind we seek today, not personal fulfillment or freedom of expression, but purpose rooted in community, faith, and function. You served your God, your city, your family. You knew the rhythms of the calendar, the festivals, the times to sow and reap. You feared the underworld, but you also sang to the heavens. You worked, you remembered, you prayed, you belonged. Could you have adapted? Maybe. With time. You'd need to learn the language, the rules, the signs. You'd need to build calluses on your hands and your heart. You'd need to let go of comfort and embrace structure. Eventually, you might know where to walk, when to speak, which bread vendor gave the best deal, and how to step into a temple without insulting the entire pantheon. But that first day, you'd sweat through your tunic, you'd misunderstand gestures, you'd offend someone, you'd step on a sacred threshold, you'd offer the wrong coin, you'd mispronounce a god's name, you'd forget to bow. You'd call barley wheat and get laughed out of a stall. You'd walk into a home with your left foot first and be told the spirits would now follow you for 3 nights. And yet, even as you failed, you'd feel something ancient stirring in the dust and stone around you, the thrum of life layered deep in the earth, in bricks, in bones. Babylon never stopped humming. Not really. Even when the city fell, even when the last temple crumbled, even now, as its ruins bake under the Iraqi sun and its name flickers through textbooks, novels, and whispered myths. Because Babylon didn't die. It transformed. Its memory was carried east by traders, west by conquerors, and upward by priests who looked to the stars and told new generations to keep watching. It became a metaphor, a symbol of grandeur, pride, confusion, and human ambition. Poets called it cursed, historians called it brilliant, prophets called it wicked, scholars called it advanced. And somewhere in the middle of all that, in the dust, in the law, in the stars, is the truth. Babylon was human, magnificent, messy, sacred, strange. It reflected everything people are capable of, both the beauty of creation and the burden of control. It built towers so tall they touched the sky, and it carved laws so sharp they shaped behavior. It believed in gods who could love, punish, protect, and abandon just like people. It endured hardship, rebuilt itself, rose again, and finally let time carry it away. So, would you last a day in ancient Babylon? Probably not, but maybe that's the point. You weren't meant to fit in perfectly. You were meant to look, to listen, to wonder, to feel the heat on your back and the laws in the air and the gods in the dust. To realize that even in a world of confusing rituals and hard edges, people were still people, flawed, hopeful, fearful, resilient. And in that realization, you've lasted long enough. You've walked the streets, you've tasted the barley, you've heard the drums, you've bowed to the statues, counted the stars, and watched the shadows stretch across the courtyard. You've met Babylon, and that, finally, is enough. So, you think you would have made a good gladiator. Maybe you've watched the movies, imagined stepping into the Colosseum with the sun catching just the right angle on your bronze helmet, sword in hand, crowd at your back. Maybe you see yourself as the lone hero, fearless, lean, brooding. But let's rewind a bit. Let's take away the camera angles, the dramatic music, and the clean, cinematic dust. Because being a gladiator was not a heroic path, it was a punishment, a death sentence, a business. And for the vast majority who ended up in the arena, it was about as glamorous as sleeping in a sewer and being cheered on while someone tried to disembowel you. Let's start with your morning. Assuming you're still alive, that is. You would have woken up not in a private chamber but in a cramped, dark, reeking cell inside a training school called a ludus. It would be noisy men groaning, coughing, shuffling around on straw mats. You might be chained to a wall, or if you were one of the better performers, maybe just locked behind thick bars. Forget feather pillows. Your bedding was usually a pile of straw that smelled like every other sweaty gladiator who had used it before you. Sanitation was not exactly a Roman priority when it came to prisoners. You did not wake gently. You were kicked, shouted at, or startled by the clatter of a wooden training sword against the iron bars. If you were lucky, breakfast came next. And let's not romanticize that either. Gladiators were fed a highly regulated diet designed not for speed or agility, but for bulk and stamina. They were called horderii, which basically means barley men. You got barley porridge, maybe some beans or lentils, and the occasional sour wine or vinegar water to wash it all down. Meat was rare unless you won a fight or had a wealthy sponsor. The goal was to fatten you up, not for health, but to give your body enough padding to survive cuts. Fatter gladiators bled more impressively, but died a little slower, which was great for the crowd. Then came training, which was long, brutal, and repetitive. From sunup until near sunset, you drilled under the supervision of a lanista part coach, part prison warden. These men did not care about your personal story, your dreams, or whether you used to be a farmer or soldier or just someone who said the wrong thing at the wrong time. Their job was to shape you into a weapon. You were trained to fight with wooden swords weighted heavier than real weapons. You were taught how to fall, how to block, how to die in a way that pleased the crowd. And this training happened outside, under the Roman sun, often in dirt arenas surrounded by high walls and leering spectators who could peek in through slits. The heat was exhausting. The armor scratched. The wooden sword splintered your palms. The lanista carried a whip. He used it. You were expected to improve or suffer, and improvement meant pain. Broken bones, bruised ribs, dislocated shoulders, none of that got you a rest day. If you could stand, you could fight. And fight you did, often against your fellow prisoners, sometimes with dulled weapons, sometimes not. If a man died during training, there might be a murmur of regret, but usually it just meant more food for the rest of you and a reminder to keep your guard up. Outside of training, the life of a gladiator was a strange blend of celebrity and slavery. The Roman public adored you from a distance. You might be the subject of street gossip. Artists painted your likeness on walls. Wealthy women whispered your name during parties. Some of them even paid for secret visits. Gladiators were oddly eroticized, both admired and reviled. People loved the fantasy, the blood, the danger, the sculpted bodies, but they rarely thought of you as fully human. You were property, entertaining property, like a circus tiger or a racehorse. And that meant you could be sold, traded, punished, or killed on a whim. Your lanista had full control over you. He could lease you to a distant arena or deny you food if he felt your performance was lacking. He might even rent you out for banquets where you would serve guests while wearing armor for amusement, or worse, fight mock battles in someone's backyard while senators laughed and sipped watered wine. But let's talk about the arena, the part everyone imagines. Let's say you made it that far. You're fed, bruised, and still breathing. You're scheduled for a match in the amphitheater. Maybe even the Colosseum if you were well known. That morning, you'd be oiled up, dressed in your armor, assuming you were not in the class of unarmed victims thrown to wild animals for sport and paraded in front of the crowd. The crowd was vast, tens of thousands, some of them drunk, many of them screaming your name or betting on your blood. Women wept. Children pointed. The air was filled with the smell of sweat, dust, animal dung, and anticipation. Trumpets sounded. A sponsor or noble might step forward to make a speech. Then you were shoved into the ring with another man who, like you, had something to lose. And then the fight began. You did not fight to win a war. You fought to survive. Each opponent came with his own style, his own weapons. You might be a secutor, armed with a short sword and shield. Or maybe a retiarius, armed only with a net and trident. Some men had helmets with narrow eye slits. Others wore nothing at all on their heads, making it easier for the crowd to see the blood. The fights were choreographed to a degree, especially in the early empire, but they were still dangerous. People died. Even if you survived, your body told the story scarred, battered, and older than your years. And if you lost, the worst moment came not with a blade, but with a hand. The sponsor might turn to the crowd. The audience would shout and gesture. Thumbs up or down, although in truth, the gestures were more complex. A signal, a call, a whim. And then, if it was decided, the victor would be told to end it. You might be given a moment to kneel. You might be allowed to speak a final word. Or maybe you would be struck from behind, in the neck, quick and brutal. And if you won, you got a moment of applause, maybe a little money, maybe a wreath. You would be dragged out, bloodied, alive, and sent back to the ludus, to sleep on your straw, to eat your barley, and to hope that, the next time, your luck would hold. In the next part, we will look at how the whole gladiator system was born, who built it, why it became so central to Roman life, and what it said about the empire itself. Because behind the noise and blood, the arena was not just entertainment. It was a mirror one that reflected the values of an empire both brilliant and brutal. By the time a Roman gladiator stepped into the arena, he was already part of a system older and stranger than most people realize. Gladiator fights did not begin in the Colosseum. They did not start with emperors or massive crowds. They came from something darker, something smaller, something far more personal. It began with funerals. Back in the early days of the Roman Republic, when the city was still carving itself out between hills and fields, funerals for noblemen sometimes included a special send-off. To honor the dead, 2 slaves would fight to the death at the graveside. Blood would be spilled as an offering to the spirits, a way to give the soul of the deceased a strong escort into the afterlife. That sounds grim, because it was. There were no cheers, no popcorn. It was about ritual, not entertainment. But as with many things in Roman life, a little blood turned into a lot. As time went on, wealthy families began to compete, not just in funerals, but in spectacle. One family hosted 2 fighters. The next one hosted 10. The crowd grew. People began attending these events not to mourn the dead, but to watch the violence, and the Roman elite, never once to pass up an opportunity for power or applause, leaned into it. By the late Republic, public games had become a way to win votes. Politicians sponsored them to build popularity. The bigger the show, the better the chances at election. If your favorite gladiator survived the fight and your sponsor paid for it, you remembered that name come voting day. It became political theater and eventually state policy. By the time the empire rolled in, gladiator games were no longer occasional events. They were part of the Roman calendar. Festivals, religious ceremonies, military victories, they all included public games. Emperors used them to distract, reward, and control the masses. A bored city was a dangerous city. A cheering one was easy to manage. And so the games became bigger, louder, bloodier. And so did the arenas. The Colosseum, the most famous of all, was not just a sports stadium, it was a message. Built by the Flavian emperors, especially Vespasian and Titus, it rose from the ruins of Nero's private palace as a gift to the people. It said, "We took the land from a tyrant, and now we give it back to you." Free shows, bread and entertainment, the people cheered, and the Colosseum roared. But the gladiators? They were never the main attraction at first. The early shows featured wild animals, lions, leopards, elephants, bears. They were brought in from every corner of the empire. Some were trained to perform tricks. Others were used in staged hunts. Sometimes they were set loose on prisoners or criminals, men and women condemned to death for real crimes or simply for being in the wrong class. But the gladiators were different. They were professionals, sort of. Most gladiators were slaves, captured in war or sold by debt-ridden families. Some were criminals sentenced to the arena instead of execution. A few volunteered desperate men looking for fame, money, or a chance to start over. Those who volunteered gave up their freedom, signing contracts that allowed them to be beaten, bled, and possibly killed for public amusement. They trained in ludi, gladiator schools, where they were branded, numbered, and drilled like soldiers. There were many such schools, but the largest and most famous was the Ludus Magnus in Rome, connected by underground tunnels to the Colosseum itself. From the outside, these schools looked like prisons. On the inside, they were brutal factories for producing performers. Gladiators were divided into types, each with specific armor, weapons, and fighting style. The Murmillo fought with a heavy shield and short sword. The Retiarius fought with a net and trident. The Secutor was designed to chase. The Thrax used a curved blade and small shield. Each type had its own rhythm, its own purpose. They were paired not at random, but for contrast: speed versus strength, armor versus agility. It was not just fighting, it was choreography, a deadly ballet. And each fight was about more than just blood. It was about image. The Roman audience was not passive. They watched closely. They booed. They cheered. They placed bets. They studied the style of each fighter the way modern fans study sports stats. They loved drama. A man who fought bravely and died well could be remembered forever. A man who begged, hesitated, or ran, he was booed, jeered, sometimes even killed after surrender just for disappointing the crowd. This obsession with violence was not seen as strange by the Romans. To them, it was part of life. Strength was celebrated, weakness was punished, blood was a symbol of honor, death was a stage. And the emperor, sitting high above the crowd, was both sponsor and judge. Sometimes he would give mercy. More often, he would let the crowd decide. And the crowd, once stirred, rarely asked for kindness. It is easy to think of these games as savage, as primitive. But the truth is, they were structured, rehearsed, even regulated. There were referees, rules, and medics. Injured fighters were patched up between shows. Some were given rest periods. Some earned prize money. The best fighters became celebrities, with fans, graffiti, and sponsors. They could even be granted freedom, a wooden sword called a rudis, marking them as a man who had earned his release. But very few lived that long. Most died in the arena. If not in their first year, then soon after. Some died from wounds, some from infection, some from sheer exhaustion. They were replaceable. There was always another man waiting in the wings, another hungry volunteer, another prisoner promised a chance. In the next part, we will step into the ludus itself, the training ground where gladiators lived, bled, and waited. We will see how they ate, how they slept, how they trained, and how they dealt with the long, anxious days between battles. Because in many ways, it was not the arena that broke them. It was everything that led up to it. If the Roman arena was the grand stage, the ludus was the cage that prepared you for it. This was not a school in the way most of us imagine schools. There were no books, no lectures, no time off for good behavior. The ludus was a training ground built like a prison. Tall walls, locked gates, guards who watched you more like property than people. And if you had dreams of escape, forget it. The Roman Empire had a way of finding what it wanted, and if it lost you, it would replace you faster than you could untie your sandals. Most gladiators lived inside the ludus full time. There were no quick strolls around the city or evenings off to visit friends. You lived where you trained. You slept in dormitory-style cells, usually shared with another fighter. The air was hot and stale, especially during the summer. There were no windows, just slits in the walls that let in dry air and distant echoes of Rome's streets. Your bed, if you can call it that, was a wooden platform with straw on top. If the straw was moldy or full of lice, you picked through it and dealt with it. Blankets were coarse. Pillows were rare. You did not sleep to dream, you slept to survive. Because when the sun came up, you would be run ragged until it went down again. A typical day began early. Before the city outside had even stirred, the lanista, the man who owned and trained you, made his rounds. He would inspect the men, check injuries, sometimes bark out instructions. He was not your coach in the modern sense. He was your master. He had the power to punish you, lease you, or sell you. He could deny you food. He could arrange a fight. And if he thought you were not trying hard enough, he could replace you with someone more desperate. Training began after a simple breakfast, usually a bowl of barley porridge or boiled beans. You might get a crust of bread, sometimes a small fig if supplies were good. Meat was rare. Fats and oils were more common not for flavor, but for building bulk. A fatter gladiator survived longer. It was not about health or nutrition. It was about keeping you alive just long enough to make money off your fights. The training yard was brutal. Open air, packed dirt, and the smell of sweat, blood, and metal. You trained with rudis, wooden swords heavier than real ones, meant to build strength and discipline. You were taught to lunge, parry, strike, and fall. Repetition ruled the day. You did the same drills hundreds of times until they became second nature. You were trained to protect your exposed areas, to read your opponent's eyes, and to always fight with performance in mind, because the arena was not just a battle, it was a show. There were sparring matches too, often more violent than necessary. These were real men with real injuries, practicing with tools that could still break bones. There were referees, but little sympathy. You might be paired with a fresh recruit one day and a seasoned killer the next. And if you lost a tooth or broke a finger, you wrapped it and kept going. Armor and weapons were fitted to your gladiator class. Some fighters wore heavy helmets with tiny eye holes that reduced vision to a narrow tunnel. Others had nothing to protect the head at all. Some classes used round shields and curved swords, others nets and tridents. You trained in your gear constantly. Even if it cut, pinched, or weighed you down, you wore it until it became a second skin. And training did not end when the body gave out. Mental drills followed. The lanista might make you recite tactics, fight sequences, or even rehearse death scenes. Yes, that was part of the job too. Knowing how to die well dramatically, honorably, with your eyes open and your chest out could win the crowd. A well-timed collapse or a dramatic final breath might convince a sponsor to spare you. Or, at the very least, it made for good theater. Some gladiators had moments of relief between training sessions. They might be allowed to rest, bathe, or receive visitors. Sometimes women came, wealthy Roman women known for their fascination with gladiators. These were not romantic affairs. Gladiators were viewed as thrilling, exotic, dangerous. The attraction was one-sided. The women were free. The men were chained. And not everyone had visitors. Most were forgotten. Prisoners from distant lands, criminals, or men too poor to have family in Rome. The only real company was each other. Fighters formed bonds. They shared advice, jokes, and scraps of food. They wrapped each other's wounds and sometimes whispered about escape, even if they knew it would never happen. Punishment was common. If you disobeyed, you might be beaten, starved, or placed in solitary confinement. There were darker rumors, too, of men forced to fight to the death as punishment, or thrown to animals during practice. The lanista had near total control. Gladiators were assets. When they stopped performing, they were discarded. But the ludus was not only a place of brutality, it was also strangely efficient. Medical care, for instance, was better than for most of Rome's poor. Not because the trainers were kind, but because a healthy gladiator was more profitable than a sick one. Broken bones were set, infections were treated, cuts were stitched, you were repaired but never coddled. At night, the ludus grew quiet. The torchlight flickered across stone walls. The moans of injured men echoed through corridors. Some prayed. Others wept quietly. You never knew if tomorrow's training would lead to an arena, and you never knew if the arena meant death. You slept with one ear open and your hand near your side. Trust was rare. And even in the stillness, you felt the weight of eyes. The city never stopped watching. You were a spectacle in waiting, a showpiece in training. Even your pain had an audience. In the next part, we will follow a gladiator's journey into the arena from the rituals of preparation to the moment the gates open and the crowd roars. We will walk through every beat of the fight itself, not as a movie moment, but as a raw, tense, minute-by-minute test of survival in the most unforgiving theater of the Roman world. There is a certain kind of silence that comes before a fight, not the peaceful kind, not the quiet of a calm morning. This silence is heavy. It presses on your chest. It sits behind your ears. For a gladiator, the day of a fight began with that silence and a feeling in the stomach that mixed fear, hunger, and resignation into a single nauseating lump. No one spoke much when the sun first touched the stone walls of the ludus. Some men stared at the ceiling, blinking slowly. Others prayed to gods they barely believed in. A few paced. One or two might hum quietly under their breath, not to be brave, but to keep the thoughts from slipping into panic. The lanista walked the halls without speaking, his eyes scanning faces. He already knew who would fight. You were told the day before. That way, you had all night to think about it. You rose from your straw-covered bed slowly, carefully. Everything felt heavier. Your arms, your armor, your breath. Breakfast was given, though few ate it. Maybe barley bread. Maybe a few figs. Some wine diluted with water. You were told to eat for strength, but who could eat when their hands were shaking? Then came the preparations. A medic inspected you briefly. Your wounds had to be closed, bruises wrapped. They could not risk sending a man into the arena who would collapse too soon. A good fight required drama, balance, suspense. Next, the attendants brought your armor. Each piece was familiar but always uncomfortable. The leather straps bit into your skin. The helmet, heavy and hot, turned the world into a tunnel. Your weapon was checked, balanced, handed over like a final gift. And then the oil. Your chest, shoulders, and arms were rubbed with oil to make your muscles shine under the sun. It made you easier to see from the stands. You were not a soldier, you were a spectacle. A living statue shaped by pain, hunger, and fear. If you had a nickname or a reputation, it might be whispered among the spectators already filing into the amphitheater. If you were a newcomer, your name might be called once, then forgotten. Once dressed, you were led out with the others, a line of men shaped by weeks, months, sometimes years of blood-soaked routine. The tunnel to the arena was cool, narrow, lined with flickering torches. It smelled of sweat, dust, and old iron. You could hear the noise before you saw the sky. The murmur of a crowd, the stomp of feet, the occasional shrill bark of a vendor shouting for attention. And then, the light. The gates opened, and the sun hit your face like a slap. The arena spread out before you like a giant open wound, massive, circular, framed by rows and rows of people. The Colosseum could hold more than 50,000. Other amphitheaters were smaller, but the feeling was always the same. You were in the middle of something ancient, hungry, loud. It felt like being dropped into the mouth of a god. Some in the crowd were already standing, waving, cheering. Others drank wine, passed bets, or shouted insults. Children leaned forward, pointing. Women waved scarves. You were a stranger, and yet you were theirs. For the next 10 minutes, 10 seconds, 10 heartbeats, however long it took, they would watch everything. A herald stepped out and called names. The crowd responded. Sponsors raised their hands. Trumpets sounded. The other man was across from you now, dressed in his own armor. His helmet hid his face, but you could see how he shifted his weight. Nervous, tired, focused, just like you. Then came the signal. There was no long speech, no dramatic moment of music, just a hand gesture, a shout, and then the fight began. At first, you circled. You kept your guard up. You listened. You waited. The crowd murmured, eager for contact. Your breathing became loud inside your helmet. Your sword felt heavier than it had during training. Every step stirred dust. Every feint drew a reaction from the crowd. Then the first clash. It was loud, brutal, the kind of sound that made your bones vibrate. Steel on steel, a grunt, a stumble, a slip. You adjusted. You recovered. You struck again. There was no elegance, no dance. It was not like the movies. It was fast, frantic, ugly. Real fights were full of missed swings, shallow cuts, and wild scrambles for footing. If a man fell, he rolled. If a helmet came off, the crowd gasped. If blood hit the sand, the cheers rose. You learned not to focus on the crowd. If you listened too closely, you might hear someone calling for your death, a child laughing at your pain, a man shouting a bet on your opponent. You tuned it out. You fought for survival. The referee watched closely. He had a staff. He would separate you if things got sloppy, but he did not stop the fight unless one of you was clearly finished. A man on the ground disarmed, bleeding. A man kneeling, arms out, waiting. If you were lucky, it was not you. If it was, then you waited for the verdict. The crowd watched the sponsor, a merchant, a general, sometimes the emperor himself. He would decide. If your fight had been brave and entertaining, you might be spared. If you had hesitated, turned your back, or lost too quickly, death was more likely. The crowd gave its signal, a turn of the thumb, sometimes up, sometimes down, sometimes sideways. Historians still debate exactly what meant what, but in the moment you knew, you felt it. If you were spared, you were dragged out by attendants and taken to the medics. If not, your opponent would finish the job quickly. A sword to the neck, a blow behind the ear. The arena could not afford messy deaths. It spoiled the mood. Back in the ludus, the survivors were silent. Some were treated for wounds. Others were congratulated. A few wept quietly when no one was watching. You had lived. For now. In the next part, we will explore the social world surrounding the arena, the fans, the gamblers, the sponsors, the lovers, and the politics that made gladiators into pawns of power and obsession. Because for every man who bled in the sand, there were dozens more pulling strings from the stands. The moment a gladiator stepped into the arena, his life no longer belonged to him. But what many people forget is that his life also never really belonged to just his master or trainer. It belonged to Rome, or rather, to the people of Rome, tens of thousands of them, packed into the stands with wine on their breath, hunger in their eyes, and bets in their hands. Because as brutal as the arena was, it wasn't a private execution. It was a show, and shows need an audience. That audience came from every layer of Roman society. The poor sat in the highest tiers of the Colosseum, squinting down from wooden benches in the hot sun. They brought bread, pickled fish, cheap wine, and wild enthusiasm. The closer you got to the arena floor, the wealthier the crowd became: senators, merchants, generals, priests. Some wore togas trimmed with purple. Others carried scrolls and betting slips, gossiping about which fighters had the best odds. Women were there too, and they were not quiet about it. Gladiators were objects of obsession, especially for wealthy Roman women. These fighters were everything their husbands were not: dangerous, muscular, exotic, and unattached. They appeared in murals, graffiti, and dreams. Some women paid handsomely for a night with a famous gladiator, and while the men of Rome scoffed at this, they often did the same with dancers and slaves. Hypocrisy was cheap. Gladiators were not. Then there were the gamblers. They came early and sat near the action. These were men who knew the names, stats, and styles of every fighter. They could recite how many victories a man had, who trained him, what injuries he had suffered. They tracked wins, injuries, and rumors. They shouted odds across the arena like traders in a market. Fights were risky, but so were the payouts. One clean strike could make or ruin a man's fortune in seconds. Even graffiti reflected this. Carvings on city walls named popular gladiators and showed drawings of their gear. Some walls had tallies of wins. Others showed symbols for crowd favorites or mocked those who lost badly. One piece of graffiti found in Pompeii names a gladiator as the delight of all the girls. Another calls a man savior of the arena, with hearts scratched beside his name. These were not private jokes. They were public announcements. Gladiators, for a brief moment, were celebrities. But like all celebrity in ancient Rome, it came with strings thick, choking ones tied to power and politics. Every major gladiator game required a sponsor. Sometimes it was a senator, other times a general, and often it was the emperor himself. These men were not just paying for entertainment. They were buying favor. Gladiator games were political tools. A well-funded show could gain votes, calm a restless population, or distract the masses from bad news. Bread and circuses, as the poet put it, feed the people and give them something to watch, and they will not ask too many questions. Sponsors wanted drama. They wanted blood. They wanted the crowd to chant their names. If a show was dull, they were mocked. If it was thrilling, they were praised as generous and powerful. Some sponsors ordered rare animals to be shipped from Africa or Asia. Others arranged for elaborate battles with themes recreations of famous wars, naval fights flooded into the arena, or mock sieges with towers and flaming arrows. And then there were the executions. Before the main matches began, the arena often hosted public punishments. Criminals, traitors, and slaves condemned to death were marched into the sand. Some were forced to fight wild animals with no weapons. Others were tied to stakes and left to be mauled. These scenes were not just about justice. They were about reminding everyone in the stands who held power. The message was clear: disobey, and this could be you. Children watched this. They sat beside their parents, learning early what Rome valued: strength, obedience, spectacle. They learned to cheer when blood spilled, to laugh when a condemned man begged for mercy. It was all part of the culture. Not because Romans were heartless, but because the system had taught them that suffering, when packaged with fanfare, was something to enjoy. And while all this happened, the gladiators waited below. In the hypogeum, the underground complex beneath the Colosseum, men paced in the shadows. They heard the roar of the crowd, the stamp of feet, the cries of animals. They could not see the fights above, but they felt them. The noise traveled through the stone like thunder. Sometimes they peeked through trapdoors, catching glimpses of flashing swords or falling bodies. They were not alone. The underground held animals in cages, stage crews ready to lift platforms, and slaves who ran messages back and forth. The air was damp and hot. The smell was thick with straw, sweat, and blood. This was not a sacred waiting room. It was a dungeon beneath a party. And yet, for all its darkness, The system worked. The city cheered. The games continued, and the names of favored gladiators were remembered briefly. A man might win a few fights and be given gifts, coins, or even a fan following. If he was lucky and skilled, he might be awarded a wooden sword, the rudis, and his freedom. Some chose to leave. Others stayed, drawn to the strange, addictive pull of the arena. Where else could a slave become famous? Where else could a nobody hear a stadium shout his name? Of course, that fame was fickle. One bad fight, one unlucky slip, one sponsor in a foul mood, and it was over. You were just another body dragged from the sand and dumped in a common grave. In the next part, we will follow the journey of a gladiator who survived long enough to win his freedom. What did freedom mean after years in the arena? Could you return to normal life? And how did the public treat a man who had been both killer and hero, slave and star? Because surviving the fight was one thing. Surviving what came after was something else entirely. There were no guarantees in the arena. Most men died before they ever got close to fame, let alone freedom. But sometimes, after years of surviving fights, pleasing the crowd, and bleeding just enough to be exciting but not enough to die, a gladiator was granted a reward, a wooden sword. It did not cut, it did not kill, but it meant everything. It was called the rudis, and it marked a man as liberatus free. But freedom was not as clean as the gesture that granted it. The ceremony itself could be grand or simple. In the Colosseum, the emperor or sponsor would present the rudis to the victorious gladiator in front of thousands of roaring spectators. The crowd often chanted his name. The fighter, sometimes weeping, would take the wooden sword and raise it high. It was his signal to the world. He had paid his dues. He had survived the worst Rome had to offer. He could now walk away. Except many didn't. Some men chose to stay in the arena even after winning freedom. They became Octorati volunteer gladiators who continued fighting for money and prestige. To outsiders, this looked insane. Why would someone choose to go back into the sand after finally stepping out of it? But the truth was complicated. A freed gladiator had no land, no status, and few connections. He had spent years being fed, clothed, and housed. Now he had none of that. Even those who did leave often found life outside the ludus difficult. Imagine living as a weapon for years, only to be told to become a civilian. You wake up with scars covering your arms, joints stiff from injuries. You flinch when someone raises their hand too fast. You are recognized in the street, not as a man, but as a former killer. Some people cheer, others look away. Some mutter about your past. Freedom, in theory, gave you rights. You could marry, own property, work. But the social weight of being an ex-gladiator never fully lifted. You were known, yes, but not always respected. You might be feared, you might be admired from a distance, but very few would welcome you into polite Roman society. You were not born into a noble house. You were not educated. You were, to them, still a fighter, still a slave in the mind, even if not on paper. A few tried to open businesses. Some sold weapons, trained other fighters, or became bodyguards. A rare few taught in ludi, helping the next generation of gladiators survive what they had barely escaped. Others fell into hard times. No skills, no family, and no structure often led to poverty, crime, or death on the streets. There were exceptions. Some gladiators became wealthy if they had fought in many games and won valuable prizes. They bought homes, hired servants, even married Roman women. But these cases were rare. Fame, even in Rome, was not always the same as success, and while the crowd loved a champion, they quickly moved on when the next favorite rose. Some former gladiators tried to hide their past. They changed cities, took on new names. They grew out their hair or stopped wearing the marks of their trade. But the body never forgot. The way they walked, the shape of their muscles, the scars on their arms, all betrayed them. People noticed. Whispers followed. And it was not uncommon for someone to ask, "Weren't you the one who fought the Retiarius at the Spring Games 3 years ago? And weren't you the one who took down that Gaul with the hammer?" Even romance was complicated. Gladiators, while often adored by women during their time in the arena, were not ideal marriage material. They were considered dangerous, unpredictable. Some women liked that. Others tolerated it for status. But many were discouraged or forbidden from marrying a former fighter. Families did not want the blood of slaves mixing into their lines, even if the man had earned his freedom with grit and steel. And then there were the dreams. Former gladiators often suffered from nightmares, though they would not have called them that. In a world without the language of trauma or psychology, these men simply called it restlessness. They drank to forget. Some returned to the ludus not to fight, but to sleep near familiar walls. The clanging of swords, the bark of a lanista, the smell of dust, these things, though once feared, became strangely comforting. They were reminders of identity, of routine, of a time when life, though cruel, was clear. Others struggled with guilt. It's easy to imagine a gladiator as a mindless killer, but many carried the weight of what they had done. They had taken lives sometimes out of necessity, other times for show. They had seen men beg, bleed, and die beneath their blade. They had heard the cheers as another man's breath left his lungs. Even if you won, you lost something each time. The soul bruises just as easily as the flesh. So what did freedom really mean? It meant choices, certainly, but also isolation. It meant waking up and not knowing what came next, a feeling unfamiliar to someone who had every hour of every day planned for him. It meant walking through markets where no one shouted your name anymore. It meant sitting alone at night with a wooden sword on your table and nothing to fight but memories. And yet, some found peace. A few former gladiators built new lives. They taught, married, raised children who never saw the inside of an arena. They told stories around fires, not always the real versions, but ones with cleaner endings. Some became local legends. Others faded into quiet anonymity. And perhaps that, after all the noise, was what they wanted most. In the next part, we will turn our eyes to the women of the Roman world, not just the wives and noble daughters, but the slaves, the servants, and the female gladiators who stepped into the sand despite everything stacked against them. Because while the arena was mostly a man's world, it was never only a man's story. The Roman arena, at first glance, was a man's world. The fighters were almost always male. The trainers, the referees, the emperors, who gave the thumbs all men. But to think that women were not present in the story of the gladiator is to miss half the picture. They were there every step of the way, watching, whispering, paying, and sometimes stepping into the arena themselves. Let us begin with the spectators. Roman women were regular attendees at the games. Not just the poor or the bored, but noble women in silk robes, dripping in jewelry, seated just behind the magistrates and senators. They brought their children. They came with friends. They clapped, they laughed, they swooned. Gladiators, with their oiled muscles and blood-slicked swords, were more than just fighters. They were a fantasy. In a world where most women had little public power, watching a gladiator become both adored and feared was its own kind of thrill. Graffiti scratched into the walls of Pompeii confirms what the official records avoided. Women had favorites. They carved their names beside hearts. One bit of ancient graffiti reads, "Celadus the Thracian is the delight of the girls." Another simply says, "Crescens, the net fighter, makes the girls sigh." These were not mere observations. They were declarations. Gladiators were Rome's first sex symbols, and women were fully aware of it. The elite found this concerning. Male writers of the time wrung their hands in their scrolls, warning that noble women were becoming too familiar with the fighters. Stories circulated of senators' wives sneaking into ludi at night, slipping past guards with coins and favors, just to be near the men who bled for applause. Some tales were probably exaggerated, passed around by gossip-hungry aristocrats, but others had weight. There are documented cases of women being caught with gladiators, even marrying them, often against their families' wishes. These relationships, even if rare, spoke to something deeper. Gladiators represented raw power, not political or intellectual power, but the kind earned through pain, muscle, and survival. In a society where marriage was often transactional, and women were expected to remain demure, the dangerous, untamed gladiator held an allure that went beyond the physical. It was rebellion, a brush with the forbidden. But women were not only spectators or lovers. In some cases, they were fighters too. Yes, female gladiators existed. The Romans called them gladiatrices. Rare, but real. These women were not trained in large numbers, nor were they allowed to fight in Rome's biggest amphitheaters. But they did fight, often in provincial cities or during smaller shows, meant to amuse and shock the crowd. They were curiosities, spectacles meant to blur the lines of gender and tradition. The philosopher Seneca, always ready to grumble about society's decline, mocked the idea of women fighting in the arena. To him, and many like him, it was a sign that Rome had become too decadent. That women, once modest and noble, were now donning helmets and taking up swords. But despite the criticism, the fights happened. The records survive. A marble relief found in Turkey shows two female fighters, named Amazon and Achillea, squaring off with swords and shields. Both survived the fight and were granted their freedom. These women were often slaves or lower-class volunteers. They were trained in small ludi, sometimes even alongside men. Their gear was similar, though usually lighter. They wore short tunics or sometimes fought bare-chested, depending on the event and the sponsor's taste for spectacle. Their fights were not treated with the same seriousness as male bouts, but they drew crowds. The novelty was too tempting, the risk too thrilling. Life for a female gladiator was every bit as harsh as it was for men. The training, the diet, the injuries, all the same. The judgment, though, was double. They were considered vulgar by some, dangerous by others, and fascinating by nearly everyone. Some audiences cheered with delight. Others watched in horror. Either way, the effect was the same. People talked. Sponsors paid. The games went on. Beyond the arena, Women's involvement with gladiators took quieter forms. Wives of sponsors might help arrange events. Female servants in the ludus brought food, water, and sometimes bandages. Courtesans mingled with the fighters during off hours, trading stories and services. Even priestesses attended some games, offering prayers for the souls of those about to die. And then there were the mothers, forgotten by most, but always present in the story. Some women watched their sons go into the arena prisoners of war, condemned criminals, or desperate boys who volunteered for a chance at food and coin. These mothers did not sit in noble seats or carve hearts into marble. They stood in the back, silent, watching, hoping, dreading. When the crowd cheered, they flinched. When the gate opened, they held their breath. For them, the arena was not a spectacle. It was a nightmare dressed in sunlight. Women were everywhere in the gladiators' world, watching from balconies, praying in temples, whispering through curtains, clapping from the stands. Occasionally, stepping into the dust with a sword of their own. They were not just background characters in the blood-soaked theater of Rome. They were part of the script. In the next part, we will walk through the end of the arena itself. What happened when Rome began to change? When emperors turned their backs on blood sport and the games lost their grip on the people? We will trace the slow death of the gladiator system and what it left behind in memory, in myth, and in the bones buried beneath the sand. Because nothing in Rome, not even violence, could last forever. For centuries, the roar of the crowd was a constant in the Roman world. From the early Republic to the Golden Age of the Empire, gladiator games were the rhythm of the people. They marked victories, honored the gods, soothed unrest, and filled the silence of Rome with blood and noise. But no empire lasts forever, and neither did its taste for spectacle. The decline of the gladiatorial games did not happen all at once. It was not a single decree, nor a sudden shift. It was slower than that of fading, a loss of appetite, a quiet turning of the head. The change began not in the sand of the arena, but in the shadows of thought. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Rome was changing. The empire had grown too large, too unstable, and too expensive. Civil wars chipped away at its strength. Emperors rose and fell with dizzying speed. The frontiers were harder to hold, the economy strained under the weight of its own ambition. And in the cities, people began to ask new questions about life, death, and the soul. Philosophy was one of the first cracks in the wall. Stoics, who had always been uneasy with the idea of people killing one another for applause, spoke more boldly against the games. Seneca, long before, had written that watching men die numbed the spirit. He compared it to murder under the pretense of entertainment. Others echoed him. These were not fringe voices anymore. They were teachers, scholars, and respected men in the halls of power. Then came the Christians. At first, they were outsiders, persecuted, ridiculed, even executed in the same arenas where gladiators fought. But their influence grew. Slowly, steadily, they gained followers. Their view of the body, of violence, and of the soul was different from the Roman tradition. They saw the games not as a celebration of courage, but as a sin against creation. Life was sacred. Blood should not be shed for pleasure. As Christianity moved from the fringes of society into the heart of the empire, the mood began to shift. One emperor after another tried to walk the line. Some supported the games openly, others reduced them. A few issued orders limiting how often they could take place, but the people still came. The old appetite died hard. The games were familiar, comfortable, part of the Roman identity. To end them outright was to admit something had changed, and Romans rarely admitted that without a fight. Still, the world kept turning. The costs grew steeper. Training a gladiator took time, money, and resources. Feeding the schools, building the arenas, and keeping a constant supply of fighters was a burden. The great empire that had once flowed with gold now had to choose between spectacle and survival. When plagues came, when crops failed, when enemies circled the borders, the games began to seem less essential. And then there was the Emperor Honorius. In the early 5th century, with Rome under pressure and Christian influence stronger than ever, he issued a decree that effectively banned gladiatorial combat. The Colosseum, once the beating heart of Roman entertainment, began to fall silent. There were protests, grumbling. Some private matches continued in secret or in the provinces, where the reach of imperial law was weaker. But the age of the arena had ended. Not with a sword in the sand, but with a whisper. What followed was not exactly peace. Rome would still see violence, invasions, collapse, rebirth in different forms. But the image of the gladiator, once so central to Roman life, began to slip into memory. The ludi were closed. The amphitheaters turned to ruins or were repurposed. Stones were carried away to build churches and fortresses. Grass grew where blood once pooled. The sands were quiet. And yet, the gladiator did not vanish completely. He lived on in stories, in faded mosaics and scratched graffiti, in statues whose names were forgotten but whose poses still spoke of combat. Children in the streets still played at being murmillos and retiari, swinging sticks and yelling to invisible crowds. The legend of the arena was too big to bury completely. As centuries passed, new eyes looked on the ruins with wonder. Medieval writers misunderstood them. Renaissance scholars romanticized them. And in time, artists, poets, and eventually filmmakers turned the gladiator into something else, a symbol. No longer a slave, no longer a pawn of the empire, but a hero, a rebel. A lone figure standing against impossible odds. Of course, the truth was more complicated. Gladiators were not all heroes. They were not all brave. Many were terrified. Many fought only because they had no choice. But myth is rarely interested in accuracy. What mattered was the feeling, the sweat, the roar, the defiance. It struck a chord. It still does. Even today, we speak of people fighting like gladiators. We imagine them as icons of strength, of endurance, of honor. But rarely do we think about what it actually felt like to wake up in a cold cell, to eat barley until you were sick of it, to strap on heavy armor knowing the next man you faced might be the last one you saw. That part gets lost in translation. In the next part, we will explore what archaeology has uncovered: the bones beneath the sand, the weapons rusted in the dirt, the tablets, the graffiti, the remains of schools and arenas that tell the quiet truths the myths forget. Because the gladiators did not leave behind books, they left behind scars in stone and bone. And sometimes that says more than any scroll ever could. Long after the crowd stopped cheering and the last swords clattered to the dust, the silence of the arena remained. The Colosseum still stands, of course, weathered by time and earthquakes, a hollow echo of what it once was. But beneath the arches, beneath the cities, and deep in the soil of forgotten amphitheaters, pieces of the gladiators still wait. Their stories, once drowned in cheers and blood, now speak through dirt, bone, and broken stone. The first and most immediate discovery that tells us about these men comes from their remains. In places like Ephesus, York, and Pompeii, archaeologists have uncovered burial sites believed to belong to gladiators. These are not the grand tombs of senators or generals. They are simple, sometimes communal, but they hold more truth than 1,000 inscriptions. Their bones speak plainly. You can see the years of trauma, fractured ribs, healed sword cuts, smashed knuckles, and worn-down joints. Some skulls show repeated blunt force injuries, likely from training accidents or repeated combat. In one case, a skeleton showed a clean hole through the side of the skull likely made by a trident. Others had leg bones thickened from the constant pressure of heavy armor. But what stands out most is the consistency. These men were physically strong, well-fed, and had medical care that was better than the average Roman citizen. Their diets, confirmed by isotopic analysis, included high levels of calcium and carbohydrates, barley, beans, and mineral supplements made from plant ash. This lines up with ancient writings that called gladiators barley men. They were not lean and agile like modern athletes. They were thick, muscular, padded with mass that made wounds less deadly. Some of the most famous archaeological finds have come from Pompeii. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in the year 79, it froze the city in time. Among the bodies preserved in ash were gladiators and their families. In one building, believed to be a ludus, researchers found armor, weapons, training tools, and even the remains of a man who had likely tried to escape during the eruption, chained in place. One of the most curious items discovered was a piece of graffiti etched into a wall near a training ground. It showed two gladiators mid-fight, with names scribbled beside them. One had a crown drawn above his head, a mark of victory. The other had a scratch through his name. Just like that, in a few lines of charcoal, someone captured the tension of a real match. Not from a historian's point of view, but from the audience's. Graffiti, in fact, is one of the richest sources we have for understanding how gladiators were seen by the people. In cities across the empire, you can still find names carved into plaster, sometimes with hearts, other times with curses. People wrote messages like Spiculus, the darling of Rome, or Verus, winner of 15 matches. It was as if fans were keeping score, cheering their favorites, and adding a very human layer to a very brutal world. In some amphitheaters, inscriptions and carvings list the names of fighters, the dates of matches, and even the odds. One stone tablet records a match between two gladiators and notes that both were granted mercy, something that would have been rare enough to deserve commemoration. These little clues scattered across ruins and museum drawers stitched together a clearer picture of what life was actually like. Even the weapons tell a story. Gladiator gear, found in places like Pompeii and Carnuntum, reveals a great deal about their routines and expectations. The helmets were often heavy, with narrow eye slits, designed to limit vision and increase drama. Shoulder guards, greaves, and chest plates were custom-made for specific classes of fighters. Some had detailed engravings, not just for intimidation, but for showmanship. These were not practical weapons meant for efficient battle. They were tools of theater, as much for the audience as the opponent. In the city of Carnuntum, in modern-day Austria, archaeologists discovered a remarkably preserved ludus. Using ground-penetrating radar, they mapped out an entire gladiator school training halls, sleeping quarters, and even a bathhouse. It was the size of a small fortress. There were traces of where men had practiced, where they had slept, and even a small graveyard nearby. It painted a picture not of mindless savagery, but of routine, order, and discipline. There were other surprises, too. In the bathhouse, walls were covered with carvings, not just names, but drawings of horses, animals, and people. It was a reminder that even men trained to kill still carved little symbols to pass the time. They waited, they scratched, they left pieces of themselves behind. And then there were the cemeteries. Some gladiators were buried with honors. Not many, but a few. One tombstone from Turkey honors a gladiator named Diodorus, who was killed unfairly during a match. The stone does not just list his victories. It accuses the referee of making a bad call. Even in death, Diodorus wanted justice. His voice still echoes from the stone, angry and proud. These finds, while scattered, give us something more precious than myth. They give us truth. Truth with chipped teeth, cracked bones, and faded paint. Truth that shows gladiators were not silent brutes. They were men. Some were volunteers. Many were slaves. Some found glory. Most found pain. They were not heroes in the modern sense. But they were remembered, at least by someone. A fellow fighter, a trainer, a fan with a piece of charcoal. In the next and final part, we will bring the story to a close. We will walk once more through the dust of the arena, but this time with all that we have learned. We will remember the gladiator not just as an image or a symbol, but as a man made of fear, flesh, and endurance, because behind the spectacle there was always a person, and behind every myth a heartbeat. The sand has settled. The last sword has fallen. The cheers have gone quiet, fading like smoke into history. There is no more training, no more clashing metal, no more blood smeared across the floor of the amphitheater. What remains now is the silence, the kind of silence that settles over old ruins and worn stones, the kind that lets you hear what noise once tried to hide. The gladiator is gone, but he was real. Not the version carved in marble or imagined on screen, but the man behind the armor, the one who woke up with aching limbs and bruised ribs, the one who squinted into the sun as he was pushed into the arena, unsure if he would live another hour, the one who ate barley and beans because that was all his body needed to bleed just a little slower, the one who was stared at, shouted at, wanted and feared, the man who dreamed of home even if he barely remembered what home meant. We have walked beside him now for 9 parts. We have felt his fear. We have seen the scars. We have heard the roar of the crowd and the heavy stillness that followed every match. And we have watched as his world changed from center of spectacle to forgotten footnote in dusty scrolls. His journey was not clean. It was not glorious, but it mattered. Because in understanding him, we understand something ancient and something deeply human. Gladiators were not born. They were made, forged in pain, trained in routine, polished for public display. Their world was shaped by empire, by power, by the insatiable Roman need to turn violence into theater. And while the crowd screamed for blood, while emperors used them as pawns in grand political games, the gladiator endured, not because he wanted to, because he had to. What surprises most people is how long that endurance stuck. Even after the games faded, even after the Colosseum began to crumble, the gladiator's image never left us. He stayed in our art, in our books, in our fantasies. He became a symbol of strength, of rebellion, of defiance, and like most symbols, he was changed. We smoothed the rough edges, we gave him dignity he was rarely allowed. We imagined him as a noble warrior, fighting for freedom, earning honor with each blow. But the truth was far messier. Most gladiators fought because they were forced to. Their victories were often small and short-lived. Their deaths were not always brave. Their lives were rarely their own. And yet, that doesn't make them any less worthy of memory. If anything, it makes them more. Because the real story of the gladiator is not one of heroism, it is one of survival, of waking up every day in a system built to break you and managing to live anyway. It is a story of men, and sometimes women, who endured not just the blade, but the boredom, the hunger, the humiliation, and the noise. They lived in a world that watched them suffer and called it sport. And somehow, they kept going. Some did find freedom. Some walked out of the ludus for the last time, holding a wooden sword and a second chance. Some found love, even if it was fleeting. Others died in the arena, face down in the dirt, with only the crowd to witness their final breath. Each life different. Each death a line in a larger story the empire never quite finished writing. What remains of them now is scattered, a bone here, a helmet there, a name scratched into a wall that no one bothered to clean. These fragments are not grand, they do not shine, but they are honest. They tell us that these men were real, that they were more than myth, that they were not just warriors, but people flawed, scared, hungry, tired, proud. And that might be the most important thing to remember, that underneath the armor, beneath the stage lights of the Roman world, each gladiator was just a man trying not to die. Today, when we see the Colosseum, we see a monument, a symbol of Roman glory. Tourists take pictures. Guides tell stories. But look closer, listen longer. Imagine the sound of metal hitting bone, the breath of a fighter in his last minute, the moment before the gate opened, the silence afterward. That is the gladiator's truth. Not the fame, not the cheers, but the in-between, the hard mornings, the sleepless nights, the slow healing of wounds that never quite disappeared. The moments when death stood close, and you had to look it in the eye and keep moving anyway. He was not a hero in the way we like our heroes to be. He did not ride off into the sunset or win the war. He simply fought the battle right in front of him, one match at a time, one injury at a time, one choice at a time. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the lesson the gladiator leaves us is not about courage in the face of enemies, but about endurance in the face of a world that wants to use you and forget you. Maybe the story he gives us is not how to win, but how to last, how to breathe through the pain, how to hold your ground, and how to carry yourself with dignity even when the crowd only wants a show. Because the crowd always leaves, the arena always empties. But what stays, what truly matters, is the human being who stood there, bloodied, bruised, still breathing. And now, long after the gates have closed and the sand has been swept away, we remember him. Not as a champion, not as a killer, but as a man. And that, finally, is enough.